recording. We got one straggler coming in. We're up to 21. Well, welcome back. This is Thursday, July the 9th at 6 o'clock, and we are starting our fourth session now. Time goes by. Like I said, it seems like everybody who needs to be is finding their way to the YouTube site. I'm seeing that a lot, a non-trivial amount of people are going and watching back over at least parts of the previous lectures and sessions. That's great to see. Especially if you have to miss part of anything, don't hesitate to go back and rewatch something. And if you have any questions, obviously, shoot me an email. I haven't ever said this anywhere explicitly, but I generally stop responding to emails after like 5 in the afternoon during the week. And I really don't have a lot of time on the weekends to respond to emails. I'm not going to ignore you if I see your email, but I did notice that I got some late emails. Maybe it was last night that I didn't get a chance to respond to until this morning. So just know that going in that, like, if you need like a quick response to something, the earlier you can give me an email, the better I am about responding to it. Other than that, so like I sort of teased earlier on before I started recording, what we're going to talk about mostly today is going to be patterns of development. We've talked a lot about purposes of writing. We've talked about expressive writing and narrative writing. You've done some narrative and expressive writing now. And the two readings that you did for today are a different purpose. We're turning to referential writing. Y'all are now gearing up to turn in the research free writing, and we're turning towards more persuasive research-based informative writing for the rest of the semester, and analytic kind of writing. And so hitherto we have not really discussed anything about content creation. So what we're going to talk about today, for sure, in addition to referential purpose, which we'll get to later, are going to at least be description and narration. And hopefully I have enough space today to maybe talk about classification and some strategies of classification that are important. If we don't get to classification today, we can always kick that one down the road, talk about it on next Tuesday. But without any further ado, does anybody have any questions about anything? Everybody seems to be sort of logging in correctly. I'm not getting a whole lot of confused and panicked emails. Great. So I will, let's see, let me pull up these and I'll start a share on that. Expand that out a little bit. All right. So what you're seeing up there now, patterns of development. So our major ideas that we're going to talk about here are narrative cues, plot, and causation. And one of the things that you're going to see in the notes that I left are the main thing that I was looking for in your discussion threads that were due today at noon were, your sense of narrative, your sense of narrative cues, your sense of causation. How does one thing lead to another? Those kinds of things, doling out the steps of a process. And it was, like I said, it was kind of a mixed bag. Like I said, everybody did something that at the very least I wanted to call attention to and laud. Some I think were a little bit closer to what I was looking for than others, for sure. There seemed to be some responses were a little bit more expressive writing, and the actual steps of the process got a little bit buried underneath the emotions that the process or certain parts of the process might have caused you. So you'll see a lot of comments in your feedback for this discussion thread about, nice use of narrative cues. And so this is what I'm talking about when I'm talking about narrative cues. We'll go over a little bit today. Also, knowing that, going into that writing, I know that in the prompt I mentioned, refer to these notes. I hadn't exactly gone over these notes yet. So I kind of wanted to see, where are you at on these ideas? Where could you skate to on your own before I intervened and went over these kinds of ideas? So what is narration? Narration is the act of telling a story. It illustrates the relationship between events and time. And this is going to be surprisingly important later on in the semester, because narration isn't just about telling a story, it's also about mapping out the relationships between things, because a story at its heart has a plot. Nearly every story has a plot, even if the plot is as simple as I get out of this chair and I go get more coffee, right? There's an event and then another event happens. That's all a plot is a plot is just events organized in a particular sequence, which I'll get to the definition of plot in just a minute. But whenever we do turn to things like argument and things like that, the idea of cause is going to be very important. This has to be the case first, and then this can be the case. And from these two things, then you can infer a third thing, right? Logic is all about relationships in the same way that narrative in a lot of ways is all about relationships. There's a lot of cross-pollination between those ideas. And we'll sort of end with an idea about causation today. Narrative cues, these are elements of language that indicate when specific events occurred in time, or what comes before or after something else. There's a lot of things that can indicate narrative cues. There could be, verb tense. I saw some really great things with verb tense. I want to say it was maybe Katie. Yours was your response about feeding your baby. It was all in present tense, and it was very deliberately in present tense. I'd like to, I'm going to put you on a pedestal and a couple other people on a pedestal throughout, just for creative and innovative uses of language, and like sentences that are, maybe structurally very simple, but in context, I think are doing really great things. But yeah, deliberate choices with verb tense indicating when things are happening. The present verb tense, it really puts me as a reader right there as the thing is happening, right? And so these narrative cues of indicating this happens and then this happens and then this happens becomes really important. Sometimes I was reading through some of the responses and there was like kind of a disorganized sense of time. I didn't have a stronger sense. Some responses gave me a much stronger sense of like an event occurring in time, much more strongly than others. Some were dealing with long stretches of time. Some were dealing with just an hour before they went to work. Some people, at least one person wrote about the 11-year experience of moving from California. Right, so this dilation or compression of time can be really confusing to a reader. So like paying attention to things like verb tenses, your adverbs, starting things off with today versus tomorrow versus yesterday, talking about things that always happen versus things that happen occasionally or rarely, things like that. And then using prepositions to modify, the space where things are, right? Involving the dimension of space, including time, telling me when things occur before or during or after, or whether something is on or at or around something, right? There's a lot of different prepositions. These are definitely not an exhaustive list. But these little signposts that help your readers sort of navigate through what can become like pretty complex situations that you're creating, whether they're more storytelling situations or whether they're like you're walking somebody through an argument, right? It's really important to sort of have a sense of your reader being oriented in space and time. And so, like I said earlier, plot is just events arranged in a deliberate way. We're not going to bore down too deeply on plot, and I'm going to gloss over some of this stuff because some of it's a little bit more important to more Comp 2 kind of things. The important elements of plot that we're going to look at here are the idea of the inciting incident and the climax, because those are elements of the plot I think that you can really extract and look at in terms of how they're applied to narrative writing. Climax is all about tension. Inciting incident is all about like introducing the conflict itself. But these are the classic elements of plot, and you can think about these in a very deliberate way as organized as this little triangle guy down here. It's called Freitage Triangle. Freitage is an old dead German man who studied a lot of plays, and he built a pyramid out of them. He looked at a lot of Greek and Elizabethan drama, and he noticed that there are certain commonalities that shape the narrative, what you could call the vector of the narrative. We start off with this idea of exposition, and then something happens. You have these characters, they exist in a certain status quo, and then something happens, and then there's just conflict, that just builds and builds and builds until you get to a climax, and then something bursts metaphorically or maybe literally in the plot, and then there's a sense of falling action as the implications of the climax sort of tumble around, and then the denouement is just a fancy French word for the end of stuff. I think it literally means unknotting. It's the idea that all the narrative tension is unwoven at the end of a story, right? And not every play, not every story conforms to this exact shape, but it is a useful model for looking at stuff. In terms of the inciting incident, you'll hear a lot about, if you ever go on and study fiction, or even screenwriting in particular, you'll hear a lot about like plot points. And generally speaking, I think more or less there's like two major plot points, and it's the first major plot point is the thing that really starts the conflict. It's the event that propels the story forward. It's the Luke Skywalker's grandparents getting, or not his grandparents, it's his aunt. Is it his aunt and his uncle in A New Hope that he's living with? Really, nobody's watching Star Wars? I haven't seen the first Avengers movie, so I'd have to just like talk about Endgame a lot. But when the seeds of Thanos are sort of, I guess, there at the beginning. But it's the first event that like really gets the plot going, right? Luke, he meets Obi-Wan at the beginning of Star Wars. Obi-Wan's like, your father was a Jedi. And Luke's like, no, oh yeah, okay, thank you, Mike. It is his aunt and uncle. And he's like, I can't. I have to farm moisture in the middle of this desert. And then the Empire comes and they kill his family, and that's the inciting incident. Right now, there's emotional stakes. Right, he's got to go avenge his grandparents, or not his grandparents, his aunt and uncle. And so that's the inciting incident, right? Star Wars is often used as an example of something called the hero's journey. It's like a really classic example of it. It was kind of written with this idea of like the call to action, which calls the hero to act. The hero has a separation from his homeland. He goes through a series of trials and obstacles. There's a climactic battle scene. He gets some supernatural help in the form of a little green alien. And at the end of the day, he restores, like there's a return of like some sort of stasis to the world itself, right? So it's a real popular sort of fantasy narrative arc, but it fits on a lot of things that aren't fantasy either. Rising action, I won't take too much time in this. If we're thinking about these in terms of the readings that we've done, right? That first inciting incident in a pretty baldly narrative story like David Sedaris's Us and Them, you've got some exposition. We're learning about the characters. We learn a little bit about Sedaris himself and where his family's propensity to move. We learn a little bit about his mother and how she interacts with people, and then we meet the Tomkeys, and that is like the inciting incident. That's like the first thing that happens, that like now there's conflict, now there's tension beginning to sort of like ratchet or torque, you could say, using this correctly. But then like a lot of a story is rising action. It's just the stakes of the conflict just keep getting bigger and bigger. There's a looming confrontation happening, right? And until we get to this moment of climax, which is the moment of greatest tension. And then this would be that, that moment that the Tomkeys come and he has to go into his room and he's stuffing his mouth with chocolate. And it's this horrible, like emotional scene. And like that moment of climax, the moment of greatest uncertainty, his mom comes in and she's just like, just look at yourself, right? That's the moment where the tension sort of breaks and like the emotional stakes are laid bare for all to see, including the poor young Sedaris with a mouthful of chocolate giving him a headache. And traditionally, the climax occurs pretty close to the end. Doesn't necessarily have to. It could be. It depends on the kind of story you're telling, right? Like you want to talk about something like the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Each movie is going to have its own little climax, but they're all a part of a larger story, of which Endgame was kind of a climax for the entire first part, right? And now all of that stuff happened, and now they've kind of restarted again. Now the tension is beginning to build, and it's beginning to build again, and it's unclear exactly like who's the villain in this new sort of arc of things. I went and saw the the new Doctor Strange. I really want to like Doctor Strange, and like I just feel like I don't know, the sum is not as good as the parts. Like there's like a lot of moments that I'm like, this is really cool. I should like this a lot better. It's a Sam Raimi movie. There's a zombie. Like I don't know, but this is an interesting ending. We'll see where this goes. But yeah. So the climax, then we get to the falling action. The falling action, this is sort of after that moment of climax, after Sedaris has that realization, you have falling action. The implications begin to unpack, and this is that moment where he's like sort of slinks out of his room and he goes upstairs and he rejoins the family and they're all watching TV. And then you have in that like all that story is such that and a lot of stories are such that often the falling action and the resolution in like kind of what you would call like a classic short story, it kind of unfolds simultaneously and together. Like, and I'm thinking here, if you were familiar with the stories of like Edgar Allan Poe, the Cast of Amontillado, or Amontillado, I think it's Amontillado. The Cast of Amontillado is like a classic example of the story, right? There's an inciting incident, there's some exposition, we get a narrator who's like, aha, yes, 1,000 injuries this asshole did to me. I'm gonna make him pay. I'm gonna take him down into my cellar and brick him up at a wall. Spoiler alert. It doesn't end well for Fortunato. And at the deeper they get into as they descend into the catacombs, the higher the tension becomes, as he's sort of like highly ironically like, you should get out of here. This you got such a cough. You don't want to catch a cold and die. Ha ha ha. Super ironic. Surprise! I'm gonna bury you behind a wall. And then that resolution and that falling action sort of come simultaneously as Fortunato realizes, hey, you're building a wall in front of me. Hold on now, this isn't fun. I want to go back to the party now. The stories of Edgar Allan Poe like really strongly invoke this. A lot of those like 19th century American short stories really strongly adhere to that sort of nice shape of a story. But not necessarily all stories do this. A lot of the things that I've been talking about have been what we would call a nice chronological narrative. And a lot of what y'all wrote were basically chronological narratives, right? Step one happened, and then a lot of narratives I got were, I woke up at this time in the morning, right? Here's a narrative cue. It's 6:30 a.m. I wake up. One of my favorites, and I wish I would have written down who it was. It was like the first action was my alarm goes off, and the first thing I do is hit snooze, and I go back to sleep. It was great, like a great first action. I do that probably every day. I had to delete Reddit off my phone because that was my second action. After hitting snooze 2 or 3 times, then I'm just on Reddit for like 20 to 30 minutes. I've gone to varying degrees of success. Now I'm just accessing it through my web browser on my phone. So it's like not, it's just a bad way to access it. And it just frustrates me. So then I'll turn it off, then I have to get up. And then that little Duolingo bird is bothering me. He's like, you got a 67-day streak going, Chris, which is not totally true. I've used some streak freezes. But you start at the beginning, right? You start with that first thing that happens. You wake up in the morning, and then the next thing happens. The next thing happens. You put on your socks. You put on your shoes. You don't want to wake the baby while you're dressing the baby, and then you're out the door. And so then we call that chronological narratives. Yeah, it definitely makes it. It makes it it's an unpleasant experience to use Reddit in a phone web browser. So, which is good, I should have negative associations with social media. It's the last social media I have. I've gotten off of all of the other ones, and now I live a solitary life in the woods, and I just transmit distance learning classes. So, a lot of I would say like probably every narrative that I looked at today was like a chronological narrative, and that's one way to do narrative, right? You don't necessarily have to do this. Stories can be more or less told in non-chronological ways, right? We have these things called non-linear narratives. If you've ever read the work of Tim O'Brien, The Things They Carried is famously like a non-linear narrative. The first thing that happens is actually like a little bit further into, like, it's very difficult to actually piece together what the plot is, and then like you find out the end of the story like very close to the beginning, and then like it goes back in time, and then it goes way forward in time, and it's like very confusing. The more avant-garde books, especially novels, tend to not really care about the chronological order of things. They have very complicated and convoluted plots and timelines. Sometimes you can begin in the middle of stuff. We have a word for that. It's called in medias res, in the middle of things. Sedaris doesn't necessarily begin in the middle of things, right? His begins basically at the beginning, right? He's looking back in, he's, you know, it's all written in the past tense. He's talking about his younger self, so it's like this distance that's established from like an older individual writing from the point of view of still like telling a story of a child. So it's like kind of a complicated narrative perspective, but it basically more or less starts at the beginning of when he meets the Tomkeys, right? And we meet them as he meets them. You know, a lot of the stories that I got, even if they were chronological, didn't necessarily begin in medias res, right? When you wake up in the morning, that's kind of the beginning of the story, right? Some did begin a little bit further down the line. I want to say it's Patrick, when you were talking about the cabinets, I believe you begin that story where you're waiting for the bus. And then you're getting on the bus and you're going to work. So you're sort of in the middle of things as you're waiting for that. Yeah, I do. Yeah, I like, I think I prefer non-linear. I like real complex. I have a literature degree. Like I love complicated things that nobody likes. But yeah, like some of them, I really like doing a lot of work when I'm reading. Sometimes I don't, but like I enjoy a chronological narrative, but I really do like just kind of being dropped into the middle of a very confusing situation and having to piece it together and like sort of find my way out. Like it's really like nice. Which more or less describes some of my experience reading student work. I'm like, oh, okay, you had some kind of plan here. I don't know exactly how I'm getting out of this, but generally speaking, you know, narrative nonfiction of the kind that we're going to be reading, especially referential writing, we're not really talking about plotting in a sense that we're talking about when we're talking about like story writing, but having a sense of like, especially like some referential writing that you do read, you're gonna go, you know, back and forth through time a little bit. We'll talk a little bit more about how to write about tense in academic writing, because generally speaking, like the MLA is actually kind of specific about this. The MLA wants you to write in the present tense, which is pretty unnatural in a way. Like everybody wants to talk about evidence as if it's in the past, right? You know, this event happened in the past. You know, this author published this work in the past. This author said something in the past. But the MLA, like we write academic writing from the present tense. So it's always, the author argues that, you know, here's some things that the author says, you know, you can plainly see, the reader can plainly see that, you know, these are the stakes of this particular argument. It's a very weird thing to do. And it takes a little bit of getting used to. So you're not really moving around in time very much. You're kind of keeping everything in this kind of eternal present, which is very artificial. The narrator, this is the character of the voice telling the story. In first and second person narration, the narrator is a character in the action of the story, right? Sedaris himself is an actor in the story. Chris Reworia, you know, in a way, it's like you know, it's his narrative, but he's always addressing you, so you, the reader, are that narrator in a way. Third person narration, which is basically what referential writing and academic writing is. This is third person, you know, speaking, you could say, maybe less narration, more third person speaking, right? You're coming at it from an outside perspective, right? When we're talking about stories, we're talking about, you know, that sort of omniscient eyeball moving around that kind of knows all and sees all. It has like relative ability to tell you about stuff going on over here, and then all of a sudden it can change and it can tell you about all the stuff over here. It can know the inner workings of certain characters' thoughts in a way that like you could never possibly know, right? That's like a pretty omniscient third person narrator. And then when you're writing for, you know, referential writing, that's also that kind of voice that you adopt as this third person sort of omniscience, right? You can definitely see the difference in the narrative voice of, say, Allison Spencer and Carrie Funk at the beginning of their reading, if you compare her to somebody like Cheryl Strayed, who's Cheryl Strayed is just like all first person, all very highly emotive, very strongly descriptive language. Whereas, here we've got, this is basically like looking at a hospital wall. About 2/3 of US adults say science has a mostly positive effect on society, while 28% say it has an equal mix of positive and negative effects, and just 7% say that it has a mostly negative effect, according to a recent Pew Research Center survey, right? It's very objective, it's very distant, right? There's not a lot of emotional investment in the particular word choices, right? In the particular language that you're getting from that. And then, you can tell it's from the third person because there's no I pronouns, there's no you pronouns, right? The sentence has a perspective. It's just a little less apparent in the third person what your perspective is, because, it's a little bit more distance. And then finally, cause and effect, causation. And we'll talk about this a lot when we talk about fallacies in particular, fallacies being not arguments, not even, you could say, not bad arguments. Fallacies are not arguments, but they're ways of corrupting lines of reasoning so that you might believe that they're good arguments, but they're actually just errors in causation. They're errors in connecting the dots between premises and conclusions. But, like I said earlier, a plot is just a sequence of events related in some particular order, right? And cause and effect can be really important whenever you're like talking about a complicated issue that maybe has a lot of context that you have to give in order to understand. Well, to understand how X affects Y, you actually have to understand a lot of smaller things about X first, so that you can understand how these different things converge to actually affect or to cause Y, or something like that. And this is really easy to see in a lot of students writing for the discussion thread. Causation, like I said, means that one thing brings about or is the reason for something else happening. And there's generally two kinds of causation. You could talk about proximate causation. This is like the immediate cause of something, right? If I throw the lighter over my shoulder, the immediate cause of the sound is the lighter hitting the ground, right? The ultimate cause is I have begun thinking about picking up the lighter even before I grab it, right? And so it's bouncing behind me over there is actually the result of an earlier process that's starting, right? The ultimate cause of a lot of these narratives that you wrote where, you end up at work, the final thing happens. It's that first event becomes the ultimate cause for all of those things. And then that event itself probably has even more ultimate causes. It's ultimate causes all the way down. And so like every proximate cause is, sort of related to this set of circumstances that sort of that I don't want to say the word conspire, but I'm going to say the word conspire. So circumstances that sort of conspire together to produce other things causing other things, right? And then you get like chains of causation, right? Which that's all kind of an argument is at its heart. It's just a sort of chain of relationships. It's X relates to Y, relates to Z, relates to A, relates to B, relates to C. And, mapping those relationships out is like really what the heart of logic is. So whenever you're talking about narrative, the big upshot here is the big idea to take away is causation. And the second big idea to take away is plotting those causes out, right? What event needs to come first in order to lay the groundwork for later things coming. And when you're developing content based on a more narrative kind of principle, whether you're doing it with, expressive or literary writing, or even if you're sort of relating an anecdote in referential or argumentative writing, it's the same kind of moves that you're going to make, only a little bit in miniature, right? Just because we're going to be looking at referential and argumentative writing doesn't mean they're totally devoid of storytelling. Part of one of the things that we're going to look at is, how authors use storytelling as sometimes as a means of persuasion, but also sometimes in place of an actual absence of evidence. One of the things that I noticed that students sort of struggle with sometimes is differentiating out evidence of an argument and being told a story about an argument. They mix up like the, if I tell you a story that emotionally resonates with you, you might think, wow, what profound evidence of this argument, but that's not strictly evidence, right? Evidence is data. So if you're feeling an emotional connection to the narrative that you're being told, you're actually not being given evidence exactly. You're being given an emotional appeal. Whether or not that appeal is fallacious or whatever, we'll look at some of those ideas too. Any questions about any of this? It's a lot of information. Seems pretty reasonable. Let's talk about description. Another pattern of development, right? This is another way of developing content. It's going from the terrifying blinking of the cursor on a blank page to actual legitimate words on a document. And so the big ideas we'll talk about here are description and different a few kinds of description. The primary way being physical description, and then division and analysis. And sometimes analysis and division, or at least division, is sometimes talked about as its own pattern of development. But purpose pattern process includes it under the umbrella of description. So I like the way that they're organizing things. So I'm going to talk about division as part of description. And then analysis, I often like to talk, I like to introduce analysis as a part of description, but analysis is really what we're going to spend a lot of time looking at, because rhetorical analysis is a particular kind. And so for the majority, after we get through these next couple of purposes this week and next week, we'll be turning to rhetorical analysis, where you'll be looking at writing. You'll be looking at two arguments, and I'll be asking us a lot of questions about analyzing something, which includes a little bit of division, figuring out what are the parts of this thing, right? How is it working? How is it working to persuade us? And then how is it successful, right? And analysis is going to answer that second question of like, how could this be successful at persuading, or how could this be successful at doing the thing it sets out to do, right? It could be rhetorical analysis. It could be any kind of analysis, but analysis is like trying to account for the reason why a thing performs the way it does. So what is description? It is the act of illustrating, recounting, or picturing a thing in words, right? Pretty simple. And you do this through focusing on unique characteristics, describing how a thing is different than other stuff. Like, I think one of the things that you'll notice, one of the themes that you notice in all these different patterns of development, and is, what are the essential characteristics of a thing? What makes a thing unique? How is it compared to other things? It's a lot of like dividing out things by their particular properties. So understanding like, does a thing have any essential properties? What are those essential properties? How can I describe this? And one of the ways that I like to talk about description just in general is like, kind of imagine that your reader is maybe not totally ignorant, but you can imagine that I've never encountered anything in my life. How would you describe to somebody who's never seen this thing before the thing that you're trying to describe? But and you don't have to do that for everything, right? There's some point at which you have to, I think, assume some level of familiarity on the part of your audience, right? Depending on who your audience is, right? If you're writing academic writing for, an academic journal, there's a certain amount of assumptions you can make about things that you should expect your audience to be familiar with, that you don't have to rehearse all the time, right? But if you're writing for a wider audience, a popular audience, then, you might have to go back and explain some fundamental things that some people in your audience will know better than others, right? It really kind of depends on the level of expertise that the medium that you're writing for is aiming at. But I think just on the ground floor, one good way to think about description is, if somebody had never encountered this thing before, what words could I use to describe what that thing looks like, how it operates, and what it is? And like I said, there's three main types of description: physical description, division, and analysis. And you'll see that these two are very close together, division and analysis. And then division is also really close to just the general idea of classification. None of these are like really mutually exclusive. And you'll find yourself, when I tell you that, narration is one way to develop your content, I often find, you'll find that you're doing more than one pattern at a time, and sometimes in a single paragraph, right? You're using narration, but you're also having to describe stuff. You're using, you're telling me an anecdotal story. You're leading into some kind of analysis, maybe. So these things aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. Just because you're engaging in one doesn't mean you have to like ignore all the others. Physical descriptions, these create the impression of a person, place, or thing by revealing specific physical characteristics, right? Not every physical detail of everything is important to recount, right? And that's why it's important to identify maybe what are those most important things to relate about an idea, about a thing, about a place, right? What are its defining essential characteristics? We'll talk a little bit more about description when we get to class, or definition when we get to classification. But identifying what are those things that make it unique, right? What are the weird parts? How highlighting those is a really good way to draw attention to how this thing is different from other things, especially other similar things. As I said, they're all different kinds of nouns. There are persons, places, and things. So when you're describing people, this focusing on notable features which distinguish them, individual traits, mannerisms, the way they speak, maybe some physical defining characteristics about them. What specific things distinguish them as an individual that would be important for like getting a sense of their character and like how they are, right? The way that somebody walks, the way that somebody talks, the way that somebody wears their clothes, right? All of these are often forms of expression sometimes, right? Describing places, these focus on settings and sensual or emotional impressions that are left, as well as historical and cultural contexts. We didn't get like the strongest sense from Sedaris maybe of like what North Carolina itself was like from the story. But in other stories, he has a more or less strongly descriptive eye for places, especially like in Loggerheads, which is a story about how when he was a child, he accidentally murdered a whole bunch of turtles. Which I believe is now a federal crime. I don't think you could just like grab a bunch of loggerhead turtles and like try to feed them hamburger meat, which is what he did. He's a kid, right? So xenocide is fun when you're like a child. I think it would be genocide. I don't know. Somebody check me on that. I don't know what it means to kill a population of animals. But describing, specific emotional or specific attributes of the place, right? There's certain attributes about Austin that you would probably use to describe it, to mark it out from other ways, right? Like the river would probably factor pretty prominently in your physical description of Austin. Maybe that one, now there's like a lot of kind of distinct buildings. There's the big Google building that looks like a sail. There's the Rice Tower it's not the Rice Tower. I always call it that, but it's the Frostbank Tower that everybody says looks like an owl, but like it really, I don't know. I guess it does look like an owl. Is that a thing? Or maybe it was just maybe it was just designed by a guy who went to Rice, and maybe that's why I always associate it with owls. I don't know. But that has a very like notably sharp top, right? What is that? It's not a bell tower, but that observation deck on the UT campus, that's like a pretty prominent feature of the Austin skyline, depending on where you're looking at it from. It's kind of buried nowadays. Right, like physical buildings, like, as opposed to a place like Houston, which I would describe as just like, Houston is just a large parking lot with a lot of freeways running over it. There's a bayou down there somewhere, allegedly, but it's very the Buffalo Bayou in Houston is a sad thing to find and look at, especially when compared to something like the river running through the center of Austin. In San Marcos, where I live, the river is like really prominent as like a part of our town. It's like on all of our iconography. Yeah, the floods in Houston are terrible. Galveston Island, you can almost describe flooding as a feature of Galveston Island. One day Galveston Island is just gonna float away, but right, and so identifying those salient, unique, or characteristic features of what makes a place what it is, and then description of things. I mean, these are all just kind of different versions of the same observation, right? What's the thing that are making that object or that idea unique, right? What are the features of the idea? Whenever you're talking about physical things more, it doesn't really make sense to talk about maybe like the smell of freedom, although that would be an interesting exercise. But you could talk about like, the physical characteristics of like an object, right? Depending on what you're trying to describe. When you're talking about ideas, you tend to describe things in more abstractions, which will probably make a little bit more sense again when we talk about classification, because when you're describing intangible things, you're really describing like things through like a lot of synonym and antonym and a lot of like using a lot of classification, right? Because or you're using a lot of analogy, you're using a lot of like metaphorical language maybe to define and understand like certain ideas that maybe people don't have like a strong point of reference for. There we go. So strategies for physical descriptions, a set of questions that you could ask yourself. What are you describing? What's its shape? What's its color? Some ideas about its, we talked about imagery, right? Some more sensual questions. What's its taste, feel, smell, right? Again, the taste of freedom. I don't know. Maybe you write for, maybe you're a copywriter for like a hot dog company or something. And then the question of what is the taste of freedom is very important to you or something like that. But the unique characteristics, what does it remind you of? How is it similar to other things, right? How is it different, but also how, in what ways can you compare it to stuff and its overall appearance? Division shows the relationship between various parts of a whole. When we focus on division, we aim to explain the parts of a thing in detail. We want to know primarily what are the parts of the components of a thing and what are they like. It's a purely descriptive activity. Analysis is going to take the act of division and go one step further and try to account for the why. Why are the parts arranged in this particular way? But when we talk about division, we're just saying we're going to take a thing and we're going to talk about how, what are its parts made out of, right? You have an engine, you want to take that engine apart, you describe the different parts of that engine or what composes it. You have like a computer, what physical hardware compose that computer, right? And that's really the upshot of division, right? What are the parts? What is each part like? And how are they arranged, right? So it's not really fully accounting for the inner workings of the parts, really. When you're talking about division, you're just talking about purely like, here's a thing and here's the thing it's composed of, right? You can talk about this in terms of like a physical idea or not a physical idea, that I don't know what a physical idea is, but like an intangible idea. Well, what other ideas compose of this? Like, what are the parts of it, right? You could talk about, going back to this idea of freedom, right? Well, what is one of the components of freedom? Oh, the idea of liberty, the idea that you are able to move around freely and unencumbered. And you could talk about that part and how it's related to other parts of freedom, like the ability to choose what to do things, right? Some freedom is related to this idea of philosophical choice, like the idea of a free will, that you're moving around the world and you're making conscious choices. Or it could be as mundane as like, this water bottle, right? Well, this water bottle is composed, divided up, right? Well, it's made out of plastic. It's got it's got this screw top. It's missing a part that fell off a long time ago. It's now composed of a variety of stickers that have tracked my movement over the course of the last couple of years. Right now it's composed of water. We could talk about maybe what the water is composed of. That maybe we're dividing a little bit too much, right? I guess, technically this is made of dinosaurs. I don't know, right? Maybe we've gone too far at that point. But, what are the parts? What are they like? How are they arranged? Which is opposed to analysis, which tries to describe why the parts of a thing are arranged in a particular way. And this is really where the rubber meets the road between what we're going to be doing in the second half of the class and what we're doing now, where we're really just getting a lot of groundwork ideas. But in the second half, we're going to be taking these ideas and we're going to say, all right, we're going to look at an argument and we're going to say, let's divide it out. What are the parts of this argument? What are those parts like, right? How is the author using the rational or the rhetorical appeals? How are they appealing to your emotions? How are they establishing credibility? How are they using reasoning? And then analysis takes one more step and it says, now, how is it working? right? How do those parts work together to produce the idea of persuasion, right? How do these things all work together to move your beliefs on some particular idea or another, right? And like I said, you could do this to argument, but you could do this to anything, right? One of my favorite podcasts, it's a Rooster Teeth podcast. If anybody's listening to Rooster Teeth stuff, it's like an Austin-based podcasting company. It's called Black Box Down, and it's a guy that's just really loves planes, and he just talks about plane crashes. And one of the things he does is he reads, I think it's the National, it's not the Transportation Safety Board, it might be, but he reads these like reports that are just analysis of what happened. Well, how did this plane crash, right? And it does this exact steps. It divides out first of all, there's a narrative, right? The plane, took off from this airport at this point, at this time. There's an inciting incident. There's like the first thing that happens in a causal chain of destruction. There is, a narrative arc. There's a moment of greatest tension. There's a very unfortunate denouement, and a very literal falling action. And then there's like the after action analysis, where you take all of those things, you divide that out and you say, okay, what were the parts of this mistake that happened, right? Well, this screw got loosened here, which affected this other part, which affected this other part. And then they try to account for an analysis, like, why did this happen? Well, it didn't have the proper maintenance, or they forgot to put gas in it, which is a shocking amount of airplane crashes happen because people just forgot to put gas in them. Not to dissuade anyone of flying. It's perfect. It's usually a very safe thing until it's not. But I've never had any problems with flying, which is probably why I don't have any problems with listening to the podcast. Although one time I was on a plane. It was a Spirit Airlines plane, so maybe that's why this happened. I don't know if you know what Spirit Airlines is. They're kind of like the mega bus of the sky. And I remember we landed in San Jose, Costa Rica. It was like 10 p.m. and the plane burst into applause. And I was like, is this a thing that happens? Like, is this like an international flight thing? Is this, people were like, oh, thankfully the Spirit Airlines made it. I was like, I don't know, maybe I should fly American on the way back or something. I don't know. But that's the only time that's ever happened. Usually people don't break out into spontaneous applause when a plane lands, which I think is for the best. Otherwise, I don't know. That would make me nervous more than anything. So strategies of analysis. How are the parts arranged? How do the parts affect each other? Why are the parts arranged in this specific way, right? Whenever we talk about rhetorical analysis, some arguments, some writers are going to favor more or less some of the rhetorical appeals over others. They're going to favor presenting information with more or less specific details, right? Why, asking yourself, why is this arranged in this way? Why is this author showing me this? And maybe why aren't they showing me something else? Whenever we talk about fallacies, one of the fallacies we'll talk about is the fallacy of suppressed evidence or cherry picking, which is really related to this idea of confirmation bias, right? Is this author have an agenda that they're pushing at me? And if they are they pushing this argument down my throat in such a way that they are very obviously ignoring evidence that would override their argument or make their argument seem very bad, or otherwise very misleading? I'm going to talk a lot about Alex Jones when we get to that too. It's going to be great. Alex Jones he's my rhetorical plane crash. I cannot stop listening to Alex Jones. Because it's so terrible. Like, if you want a masterclass in how not to use rhetoric, watch Alex Jones. He's also very good at marketing. The man can add pivot. He can sell you on the end of the world in one breath, and then on depleted iodine and silver in the next. It's pretty incredible, the things that come out of this man's mouth. But he says some lines of reasoning, and I'm just like, it's almost like, I feel like Deborah when you're doing your parkour, maybe. Like, I'm like, oh, okay, straw man, suppressed evidence. Okay, that's a blatant ad hominem. All right, like it's nice, keeps you on your toes. On that note, that brings us to 650. Let's take 10. So the big ideas here, we'll recap just for the moment. Analysis, description, what are the unique things and how are they arranged? And then why are they arranged in this way, right? Those are the big ideas. With description, we're talking about the unique characteristics of what differentiates. When we're talking about division, we're saying what's it composed of. When we're talking about analysis, we're going a step further and trying to account for why is it composed in the way that it's composed. So go ahead and take 10, and I will see you back at 7. Okay, no problem, Mike. I'm just seeing your message now if you can hear me. got about a minute before we jump back in. I meant to tell Mike before he left. Mike wrote his about his gumbo. I wanted to leave a note on his. I was like, you could have been more specific about the ingredients of this gumbo. So I wanted to steal Mike's gumbo recipe. All right. So we're back at 7. So what we'll do now is we covered description and narration. We'll turn to referential purpose, and we'll talk about that and briefly use those readings that y'all went through today or for today as a springboard for some of these referential ideas. And I'll continue to use those as a springboard for whenever we talk to classification, and that's how we'll sort of round out things today. Before we jump totally back in, what did y'all think about the readings? The Pew Research Center and the what were they? AI map psychedelic trip experiences to regions of the brain, opening new route to psychiatric treatments. And when Americans think about science, what do they have in mind? Yay, nay, y'all enjoy these?
I enjoyed them. I am also taking my intro to psychology this semester.
Nice.
And it's just interesting because there's discussion on psychedelics in that class as well. And so it was just interesting to have additional information to read about. So that was cool.
Yeah, I've been waiting for that reading actually for a long time. I used to have a much longer reading by Michael Pollan on my syllabus.
Wait, these are meant for cards, like for IDs and stuff.
Just do that. And if you had a specific question, Travis, I think you accidentally unmuted. But yeah, this I loved this because it's by Michael Pollan. Is fine, he's a good writer, but these guys are actual researchers, and like one's an AI researcher and one's a psychiatrist. And one of the things I want to do too with these two websites is, I want to sort of walk you a little bit around the Pew Research Center and like sort of get you introduced to like why, not just the way that they write this and the way that they model information, but where that information comes from, how they build that, like why is this a credible source of information, is sort of some ideas that I want to talk about. Same thing with the conversation, right, which is they've got a lot of different subcategories that you could read about there. I use a lot of stuff from the conversation. There's stuff's in the Creative Commons, so it can be like freely republished. Same thing with Pew Research Center. They're a 501c3, and does it say Creative Commons? Maybe they're not specifically Creative Commons, but it is like you are free to share their information. So I will talk a little bit about, I don't know if we'll actually get to like talking about ideas like Creative Commons, but it's really cool. It's really useful. A lot of research-minded 501c3s use Creative Commons stuff.
I think I appreciated the one about the psychedelic research more than the first one, because they did, I think it was that one. I'm doing a lot of reading. I hope I haven't gotten them confused.
Sure.
But I liked how their resources of saying this is how this was done, this is who we used, because like I said, in psychology we are discussing similar concepts of learning. How do you know if this study is done correctly, and
exactly,
is it without bias, is it peer reviewed? So
what are their methods and sources? Yeah. Right,
exactly. So while the other one listed statistics, and I'm sure that they had references, but it was cool that they're the one who had it right there. Like, this is how we did it.
Right. It's two very different ways of modeling like factual information, right? Like this is much more of like, they've got this tagline for the conversation: academic rigor, journalistic flair, right? There's more of like, we're writing for a popular audience, and so the writing is a little bit more engaging and it's a little bit more active. Whereas, not that the Pew researcher isn't writing for a wide audience, but they kind of model their information a little bit differently. There is a tab here, the how we did this, and you can see their sources and methods. You can see their methodology. You can see this is really interesting. Here are the questions used for this report. You can actually read all of their survey questions. It is a 30-page document on its own. And that's one of the reasons why Pew is so solid with their credibility, is they give you everything. You can read all their questionnaires. If you know anything about stat, they give you sample sizes and they give you their confidence levels and their margins of error. Like this is, they give you, if you know how to read, N numbers, it's pretty intense. Probably more information than most people require, for sure. But in terms of like checking up on their sources and stuff like that, they're to me kind of like the gold standard of just like a not really a database, but like a repository of like factual information. Whereas like, here we're writing, you can really tell they model different ways of approaching audience very, very well. I think that we have like, we're clearly like writing this for like a wider audience. And we don't have, like, they're doing a lot of really good explaining. Like I was saying earlier with the physical description, right? Like there's a little bit more that Pew Research is kind of taking for granted in the way that they're just kind of giving you their interpretation of the data, not exactly like taking time to explain too much on the way through. Whereas here, one of the really great things they do is they give us, a definition of psychedelics, right? Which is, you could go to a dictionary, but it's useful to have this definition to like put the article in context. They give you, what I think is really useful is they talk about the bag of words model, and they give you a little explanation of what a bag of words model is. It's a very particular, like if you're in AI research, a bag of words model is a very specific thing, right? It's not just a bag with words in it, right? As the name might lead you to believe. So it's, and then they like kind of go into a little bit more detail about specific networks that psychotropics affect in the brain, specific regions, and top-down executive function, which I think this is also called the default mode network. And yeah, it's a really good way of like modeling really condensed information, but like in such a way that it's written at a level that most people could understand it, right? Like I think it's written in such a way that probably your average, 15-year-old literate teenager in America can understand the information here. Whereas, this is aiming towards, probably it's pretty easy to understand the things that they're saying, but as you're also pointing out, Deborah, like as you're reading along, you're maybe gathering some like, well, how did they arrive at these numbers, right? It's nice that they're saying all these things, but like, where is this really coming from? And like, how are they getting to the conclusions that they got to? So on that note, let's talk about the parts of referential writing. I have not been sharing my screen this whole time, have I? No, I haven't. So I've just been sort of gesturing at something that's not even there. Fantastic. We're doing a great job. All right. So referential writing overwhelms us in modern life. At no time in history has there been such a profusion of documents designed to explain our world. In all its various forms, the purpose of referential writing is to explain a topic, right? So, I don't know if this is like anyone in particular said this, but like, there's this thinking that like if you study like the dark ages or like the times before the internet, like, oh, the people then were so dumb, they just didn't have enough information. I think modern society is proof that it does not matter how much information you have access to. People are people, and all of their various contradictions. So we are probably living in the most literate era of human history. People are reading now more than ever. We have access to more information now than ever. If you define literacy as just like your ability to read and write sentences, which I mean, that's like the basic definition of literacy. Never before have so many people been able to do that. Most of human history has been illiterate. So, it's an achievement. It's got its pros and cons for sure. So the big ideas we're going to talk about here: referential writing, thesis statement, evidence, and tone. And these are going to be ideas that are going to live with us for the rest of the semester. And they're really only going to differ between referential writing and persuasive writing. Like the purpose is really the only difference between the parts here. The parts of persuasive writing are the same. It's just the goal is different, right? One of the things that you should have noticed in these are, right, they're not trying to convince you necessarily of something, right? There might be something like a persuasive purpose, right? Maybe you could say that the persuasive purpose of these guys, they do have sort of an idea toward the end, right? There's this little kind of call to action, right? Right. Our study shows that it's possible to map diverse and wildly subjective psychedelic experiences to specific regions of the brain, right? There's kind of an argument running in the background here that this is important. You should pay attention to this, right? But that's not exactly their primary purpose, right? Their primary purpose is to inform you about some specific research that they've done and what it demonstrates. The primary purpose of Spencer and Funk is to inform you of the results that they've gathered through their data collection, right? And to model that data for you. Whereas when we look at persuasive writing, they're going to be taking information and doing something with it. They want to move you to, change your beliefs, update your beliefs, reject some proposal, accept some proposal, modify your behavior to should or should not do certain things like that. But for referential writing, it's just really explaining a topic. A thesis statement, using valid evidence, using an appropriate tone. And you can also see, I think, the difference in tone in these two articles, especially if you compare them to something like, again, I keep going back to Cheryl Strayed, is like such a strong, expressive tone in an argument like Strayed, or not really an argument. There's definitely, you could say, the fingerprints of some kind of persuasive writing going on in hers. But the tone of that expressive writing versus the tone, which is much more subdued, it's much more... Is referential writing also known as informative writing? Yes, they're synonymous. Some people call it informative. Some people call it referential. The only reason I stick with referential is because that's what the book that I am like taking all this from, it goes by. Sometimes I change the terms that the book uses just because I don't agree with them. But generally, more often than not, I stick with what they're saying. Yeah, they're basically synonymous. Reference is just like, it's writing that is, it's literally referring to something. So it's just a referral to it. Whereas persuasive is writing that's moving to change your mind. Like you'll often hear me say persuasive writing synonymously with argumentative writing or evaluation as a pattern of development. All of these are kind of synonymous, which is also really confusing because when we get to logic, like logic has a very narrow definition of argument, and it's a little bit different than the way that we normally talk about argument. Like if I were to talk about argument most of the time in this class, I'm kind of referring to like the reading, right? I would call it like, what's Ballantyne and what is Ballantyne and Friedman's argument, right? Let's look at their argument. Let's look at the language of their argument. But in logic, an argument is very specifically usually two sentences that lead to a third sentence called a conclusion. It is very much a sentence by sentence deconstruction of language. And oftentimes when you're looking at ordinary language texts, like the ones that we're going to be looking at, that I sort of very fast and loosely call arguments, you have to do a little bit of interpretation and a little bit of synthesis to get at, well, what are the specific claims that we're looking at? If we're looking at like, okay, well, how is this author how is he appealing to reasoning? How is he using reasoning? Well, sometimes it might take a little bit of like, he doesn't exactly state his evidence, or he doesn't exactly state his premises in a very straightforward way. Maybe sometimes only the conclusion is really present, and you have to sort of kind of reverse engineer the argument out of like a couple of different things they're saying. And that it gets a little confusing for sure. But in terms of this, yeah, I use a lot of, I try to, if I use synonyms for stuff, I try to at least name a few times like, oh, this is also this other thing. Like I said, the difference between this and referential writing or informative writing is just different purpose than argumentative writing, but it's got the same parts, right? They both have thesis, they both have evidence. Are argumentative essays considered referential writings? I would say you very rarely find an argument that also doesn't have an informative purpose, but it is possible to find informative writing that doesn't necessarily have a persuasive purpose. And I'll say that with some qualification. Depending on who you ask, it is impossible to escape our ideology. It is impossible to escape your bias. And so you're kind of always making an argument for something. Whether or not that's more or less true, I tend to think that it is possible to at least put your bias on display and to have something like a purely informative purpose. Like encyclopedia writing, I think, is generally pretty bloodlessly informative. I don't think there's a lot of like agenda hunting in the construction of encyclopedias. I could be wrong about that. But generally speaking, I think that anybody who's arguing about something is probably part of their purpose is to give you information and explain something, or at least it should be. So I would say that it's like rare in the same way that the patterns of development aren't mutually exclusive, the purposes also aren't mutually exclusive. You often find multiple purposes living harmoniously right next to each other in the same piece of writing, sometimes in the same sentence. It just kind of depends on the context that language is in. Like I said, for instance, in this, like in a way, you're being told a story, right? For the past several decades, psychedelics have been widely stigmatized as dangerous and illegal drugs, right? Here, I'm being told a story. I'm being told a story that for a very long time, a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, psychedelics were often viewed widely as stigmatized as dangerous drugs. However, right, something is changing, right? And now there's conflict, actually, right? There's tension. There's people now looking into these things that were formerly looked at as dangerous and illicit. And we're in the middle of some sort of change, right? And so now the purpose kind of shifts to be informative. Psychedelics are psychotropic drugs, right? Now I'm being told what something is, right? And the purpose is referential. But then by the time we get down to the end of it, now our purpose is clearly a little bit argumentative, right? Our study shows that it's possible to do these things and that these insights may lead to new ways of combining existing or yet to be discovered compounds, right? As psychedelics and other hallucinogens become more commonly used clinically and culturally, we believe more research will further illuminate the biological basis, right? That's the argument that we're getting at right here. This is like something that they want to change your mind about. Psychedelics aren't just a thing that, I don't know, like people take and go to concerts. There's like literal therapeutic biological purpose for these things, right? There's something more that we can use these for, and which is essentially argumentative, right? It's saying that you should expand your horizon of the possible for how you should look at and incorporate psychedelics into both your understanding and society, right? That's an argument, right? So there's like, you can kind of see all of these things kind of living in this document here. And there's all, I would say, it's just a matter of, it's not really a zero-sum game. It's not like, oh, this is all this one thing, or it's all this other thing, or this is all one way to develop content, or not. Good question, though. And then again, some types of referential writing. We have scientific reports, which basically a couple of things we looked at today, some lower level scientific reports, statistical analysis, encyclopedias, with Wikipedia with a very large asterisk next to it. News articles, and when I say news articles, I'm being distinct from editorializing, right? There's the news gathering arm of a news agency, which is just like, whenever something happens in Austin, you go to KUT and there's like a report about the facts of the thing that happened. When did it happen? Who were the important people that it happened to? This was like what the official police spokesman said, right? Then there's a more editorial side of news writing, which is a lot of like, the New York Times editorial board, for instance, which is, we'll look at something that they have to say later this semester. The Wall Street Journal editorial board has their own like point of view that they like to talk about sometimes, or people will write into these different things, or there'll be like sort of opinion columnists that sort of make their bones by, I professionally interpret things for people. Tucker Carlson is one of these kinds of people, right? Alex Jones is a species of this. He is a mutant species for sure, but that's essentially what he's doing. He's doing persuasive, he's almost doing sermonizing at this point, but that's really more, very little referential purpose, but he thinks that he's doing some referential stuff. But the idea that there's this distinction between reporting the news and editorializing about the news, right? And those are distinct usually in news services, you have a distinct like departments that deal with those, right? The people that do the reporting for the New York Times and like the big paper are usually distinct from the people that write the editorial section, right? One of the things that you're going to read that we'll talk about over the long break, where I don't think that y'all have a reading for Tuesday, but you will have one for Thursday. It's the Brooks article, and I think his name's not Valentine. What's his name? The upshot there is Brooks is writing for the New York Times editorial. Or he's writing an editorial for the New York Times. It's not about you. Beckham's article, right? This is not an editorial. This is like something published in an academic journal. But David Brooks is just, hi, I'm David Brooks, and I'm writing an opinion piece for the New York Times. I have gone to this website too many times, so I can no longer read this article. We do have access to the New York Times through our library database, so you do have access to it. I'm just not logged in. But David Brooks doesn't necessarily have the bias that you might expect out of the New York Times. The New York Times is sort of famous, especially their editorial board, famously a left-leaning bias. David Brooks is kind of their softball conservative voice. So his argument might be a little bit different than what you might expect from the Times. So he's editorializing. He's not reporting the news. He's giving you an interpretation of something. And that something happens to be college, which he's not a fan of. So, thesis statement. This is a generalization expressed in a single sentence which captures the main idea of your content, right? And before I made this comparison between a thesis statement and a theme statement, right? It's a similar kind of thing, right? A theme statement being like, what main unified idea is emerging out of this narrative, right? Despite, going back to David Sedaris, you could say one of the themes that emerged out of that, I could say that, given the way that Sedaris uses like irony and characterization, his story suggests the idea that television makes people superficial and vapid, or something along those lines, right? And that would be my thesis that I would then prove through here's a paragraph where I analyze his use of irony. Here's a paragraph where I analyze his characterization, and those are going to demonstrate my thesis statement. That all of the point of each of those paragraphs would be like, I'm going to prove to you how this supports the idea that television makes people silly. For referential writing, it's really similar. Only with referential writing, they usually state their thesis. It's same thing with persuasive writing, right? And this is really important to know, because whenever we look at argumentative writing, when we do rhetorical analysis, the conclusion is the thesis statement, right? When you're doing your research papers, your conclusion is the same thing as your thesis statement. Your thesis statement is the first time you say it, but then in the actual conclusion section of your paper, you're going to restate your thesis, right? It's the point that you're coming to. The idea, and we'll talk about this a little bit more when we talk about essay structure, is that, essays kind of have this nicely circular structure to them. You start off by throwing out your conclusion at the beginning, right? Here's the thing that I'm going to demonstrate to you. Then you spend time in the bulk of your writing showing people, demonstrating your evidence, using your sources, and then you get to the conclusion and you say, all right, now here's that thing that I said at the beginning. This is the thing that I just proved, given all this stuff behind me, right? And what I liked about the Ballantyne and Friedman reading is they really do that, right? They kind of don't explicitly state their thesis in the exact same terms, but they say a recent surge of research into psychiatric conditions, into the use of psychedelics to treat psychiatric conditions, is spurring a recent shift in public opinion, right? That's really what they're trying to demonstrate, is that the surge in academic research, in this case, this academic research that they're showing you right now, is part of this shift in public opinion. And then later, when we get to the end, we have a sort of version of that same thesis statement, which is this final sentence. As psychedelics and other hallucinogens become more commonly used clinically and culturally, we believe more research will further illuminate the biological basis of the experience they evoke and help realize their potential, right? We have like a similar kind of sentiment being expressed there in a little bit different terms, but it's essentially saying like, there is new academic research that is changing the way we're thinking about this thing, right? In terms of Spencer and Funk, they are, the title is really, just kind of modeling the idea of a research question versus the thesis statement, right? Their research question for this particular report is, when Americans think about science, what do they think about, right? What are the things that Americans think about when you say science to them? Because it's not all the same, right? Even all of the things that they say that science is might not be what you specifically think about when you think about science. They don't even cover all sciences, right? Nobody's thinking about radio astronomy, apparently. Nobody's thinking about stoichiometry, apparently. Stoichiometry is just a thing that I remember from high school chemistry. It's just like something about balancing chemicals. I don't know, don't push me on details. But it's part of chemistry, right? Nobody's thinking about that, right? Clearly. And they go through, like, just because these are the things that Americans are thinking about doesn't mean these are all the things that constitute science. It's just the things that people most commonly associate with it, which is kind of useful because the word science itself, I don't know if you've been on Twitter lately, but over the past couple of years, people of all political stripes throw around the word science and very rarely stop to define what they're talking about. So it's often very useful to have some kind of point of reference to start from, to say, well, usually when people talk about science, they're talking about it, they mean this, and I have some information that supports what I mean when I say that, or this is what I mean when I'm saying science in this narrowly defined context. And we have something like a thesis statement up here, which is, basically this first paragraph, but more to the point, probably this one right here, this statement. Over the past few years, around 2/3 or more of Americans have seen science's effect on society as mostly positive, right? That's kind of the answer to the question. When they think about science, what do they have in mind? They generally have in mind a positive activity, right? Something that's producing good things. And then there's some categories of things of which are producing goodness. And those categories are usually medical science, artificial intelligence. Kind of, why do you think medical science might have been on people's minds for the past couple of years? Maybe some greater whole historical context is making people think about medical science on a daily basis. Right, and so of course science encompasses a wide swath of disparate fields, and then they restate the question, and then their answer. A few common themes arise when U.S. adults talk about when U.S. adults are asked to talk about science's effects on society in their own words, or when they discuss the areas of science they follow or find interesting. Right, and then here are the things that they mostly think about: developments in health and medicine, such as new treatments for disease. That seems to be the thing that is on people's mind. Right, it doesn't mean that it's the only thing. It doesn't even mean it's necessarily the most important thing. It's just the thing that when you ask the most people, this is what they say, which is, a useful fact on its own. Doesn't necessarily, it can be used to demonstrate a variety of different things maybe, but it's not necessarily an argument on its own or on the face of it. Evidence and validity. Evidence consists in supporting material or data for a thesis. Validity is the quality of being well-grounded, justifiable, plausible, or appropriate. So when we talk about validity, we're talking about, is it relevant to the purpose, right? Is it valid? Is it on point? Is it on topic? Is it focused towards the thing that we're talking about? When we talk about logic, we'll talk about a different idea above validity called soundness, which soundness is generally a more desirable idea, because validity, just because something is possibly relevant, doesn't mean that it's absolutely true. Validity does, and that's probably, if you take nothing else away from this discussion, validity does not imply truth. Validity implies the possibility of something being true. But if something's valid, it just means that it's, it's well-grounded, it's justified. We can point to it and we can say, there's evidence, right? It doesn't make it true necessarily, but it is the first step on the way to establishing truth. Is, before something can be soundly true, it has to be valid. Nothing that is invalid is ever possibly true. So that's an important quality for sure, but it does have its limitations, especially with an argument. Plenty of arguments are valid that are both fallacious and unsound. Just because an argument's valid doesn't mean that it holds any weight. Tone is the manner or style in which a writer expresses themselves. We've talked about tone a little bit more, and I think as you are reading more texts, you're starting to get a sense of tone. You're starting to get a sense of how tone changes depending on who the audience is. With Strayed and Bassus, that was a very, very intimate tone. It was almost a one-on-one conversational tone. With Sedaris, he's telling us a story. It's for a little bit wider audience. It's still for the first person. It has still a kind of like intimacy to its tone. And then when we start reading these referential writings, now the tone is becoming a little bit more objective. The tone is becoming a little bit more formalized. We're seeing the language put on its nicer clothes as it's giving us access to more like factual information than it is to just I guess the cargo pants that the first person expressive wears. I'm wearing cargo pants right now. Levels of formality, elements of academic tones. These are just like some ideas that are involved in creating a tone of academic formality. As I said, not all writing conveys or demands the same kind of tone, and again, we've seen that in academic writing, we use a more formal tone than in general and popular writing. And elements of the academic tone include the use of the third person. I've mentioned the use of the present tense before, right? I don't know if these writings necessarily stick to that. Yeah, this, Spencer and Funk's is in the first person. Yeah, we're in the first person here too, right? Our study shows, right? Notice they didn't say their study showed in the past tense. Their study shows that it is possible to map the diverse and wildly subjective experiences. These insights may lead to, right? This is, the future tense, but still, right? Like the future and the simple present, very close. The simple present can be used to talk about certain events in the immediate future. But lots of like very simple tenses, right? Also, we've got a nice present progressive tense going on here. The U.S. is going through a profound change, right? It's currently in progress. We look hard enough, we'll probably find a perfect tense in here. It's fantastic. I love verb tenses. We go back to Spencer and Funk, right? Again, of course, science encompasses, right? Here's our verb here. The encompassing is happening, right? It's happening in the present tense. What do they think about, right? This is actually a second person sentence because it's a question. It's not a second person sentence, it's an interrogative mood, but a few common themes arise, right? The themes are currently arising. They didn't arose, they have not arisen. No, that's in the present perfect too. They did not, the themes didn't arise in the past. Have arisen? I can't even think of how to say the past tense of arise. Arose? The themes arose? Yeah, it would be arose. It's one of those weird irregulars. Themes didn't arose. Still sounds weird. I don't know. But most prominent among these are, right? Other less commonly mentioned areas include, right? It's also important to like identify your main verb, right? Because we've got mentioned, right? To mention is a verb, but it's actually not being used as a verb here. Right here, it's actually an adjective. It's modifying areas because it answers the question, what kind of areas? Less commonly mentioned areas, right? It's a long adjectival phrase. So include is actually our main verb there. To include, to be, to draw something close to itself. Here's a closer look, right? Again, underlining this, not terribly important to go through this and find all the first person pronoun, all the present tense verbs. But the idea that we're writing in the present tense, that the academic discussion is happening in the present tense, right? And really cultivating a sense that when you're writing in an academic tone and when you're writing for an academic audience, you're entering into a discussion, right? It might not feel like it because you're in a community college, but that is what we're doing, right? And we're sort of training this idea that whenever you start writing referential and formal persuasive arguments, that you're entering into a dialogue. And it's a wider dialogue, right? It's not just a point-to-point conversation. You are entering into the conversation of academic discourse, right? And like when you enter into that, like you have to sort of like these are the conventions that we establish that we're talking about, right? And we're talking about it in the first person, or not the first person. We're talking about it in the present tense. Generally using clearly defined terms, including pronouns. One of the things I see more often than anything, maybe not more often than anything, but pretty regularly, is unclear pronouns. Your pronouns like whenever you're reading through your writing and you're writing, your pronouns always making sense to you, but then when somebody else reads it, things that are very clearly referenced by the ideas that you have in your head are not very clear grammatically. Like using the pronoun it multiple times in a sentence can get really confusing. There was, I was recently tutoring somebody, and they used the pronoun she 3 times in the same sentence to refer to two, just there had to be 2 different people. It was like absolutely unclear who they were, but they were not the same person. But just like cultivating awareness that like the things that are standing in for other things have to like clearly reference those things, because it's all about constructing like very clear ideas, right? And that's why, one of the things that they go through in the Ballantine article is, we've got psychedelics are psychotropic drugs, and we have this like, we have a moment before we enter into the discussion. We're giving you some context. I'm going to define my terms. What are my terms? This is what a psychedelic is. And they do it again when they talk about the bag of words model. They talk about mystical experiences or feelings of unity and oneness with the world, for example, are associated with decreases in depression and anxiety, right? It's a short definition of what a mystical experience is. They talk a little bit about, just kind of, sometimes these are like little clarifying phrases, where they kind of describe what's happening with the binding of the serotonin receptor. But just going through and making sure that we're clarifying the terms that we're talking about. Another thing you might have noticed, probably more so in the Funk and Spencer than you did in the Ballantine and I can't even remember the other guy's last name. Ballantine and Friedman. The tone here is a little less formal than you'll notice even whenever you look at the Beckham source, like which was written for, well, maybe not, because he's using a lot of first person. But there's not like any first person here. They're not really using contractions even. Although, yeah, no, here they are. Here's, that's a contraction. What is here? Here's a contraction of. There you go. Here it is. Contractions are they're abbreviations, right? Can't, don't, won't, shouldn't, here's. Generally speaking, whenever we're writing for an academic audience, we want to avoid those. We want to write it out. Here is a closer look, right? Whenever you see contractions are usually a feature of less formal writing. The Pew Research Center obviously has its own style. So, it's not like, there's no university associated with the Pew Research Center, so they can do whatever they want. But for most academic writing, you'll generally hear the criticism that you shouldn't use contractions in formal academic writing. Avoiding slang, colloquial language, text speak, generally avoiding cliches, right? I remember I had an example earlier this semester, the idea that time is money. It's just a cliche; it doesn't really mean anything. It might have some emotional impact for you, some emotional meaning, but like logically speaking, it's vacuous. But avoid slang, colloquial language, right? You don't want to. Slang is highly conversational, right? It's highly informal, and so reaching for more objective descriptions that slang is standing in for. In a way, slang is a kind of pronoun. It's a kind of expletive that is standing in for something else. It's synonymous for something else. So, anytime you use slang or a pronoun, there's something that is behind it. The pronoun or the slang is masking, or the euphemism. Slang's, in a way, slang's a form of euphemism, you could say. Or sometimes it's a form of euphemism. Sometimes slang is not using neutral language to cover up something terrible. Sometimes slang is even worse than the thing that you're talking about. And then generally avoiding hyperbole. To an extent, right? Highly expressive writing tends to be highly hyperbolized, right? Cheryl Strayed talking about pulling a literal beating heart out of her chest. You could call that a little bit of hyperbole, right? Exaggeration for emotional effect, right? It drives a point home well, but logically speaking, hyperbole can lead you very quickly into the realm of fallacy, where you're just sort of appealing to people's emotions in absence of evidence, right? Again, we go to Alex Jones. Alex Jones is a man constructed out of hyperbole. Everything is so hyperbolous in the way that he describes things that it's impossible to separate out what is literal and what is figurative. And it's impossible to like sort of pin down anything specific, which is why hyperbole, he is very much a hyperbole. He's like a hyperbole incarnate. He's like if if Bowser at the end of Mario were a hyperbole, that is Alex Jones, right? Like, I really like the idea. Now I want to see like a Photoshop of Alex Jones and that little flying thing that Bowser has at the end of Super Mario World. But right, avoiding hyperbole is it's another way to avoid being obscure or vague or imprecise in what you're saying, right? Because whenever you're looking at language divorced from its author and you're just trying to figure out the intention of what somebody is saying, or you're trying to assess the logical truth value of a claim, using hyperbole can be really deceptive and misleading, which at best it could be you're exaggerating, but at worst you could be just absolutely mischaracterizing something. It could be now you're making a straw man argument, or now you're appealing to pity in some erroneous way, or you're somehow or other leading people away from rational argument into just trying to sort of manipulate and play on their emotions. Right? Using an academic point of view, this is all about the third person. We avoid the second person completely in academic writing. So, just if ever you get the impulse to use the word you, just don't. Find something else to say. What's it standing in for, right? What objective, phrase or word, what noun is you replacing? And you'll probably see me talking about this, boring you to tears about breeding you out of your academic writing. It doesn't necessarily mean avoiding the first person. According to the MLA, there are some limited and strategic instances where you could use the first person. And for here, I'm referring like to the MLA itself. You'll get instructors that will tell you never use the first person. They will just flatly make a rule, and I will tell you now, defer to what your professor wants. In my class, I would prefer you to remain in the third person as much as possible, right? I would say 90% of the time you want to be writing in the third person when we're doing like your research paper, because it's not really about you, right? You're not a professional researcher in a field. I don't want to sound too harsh. I don't really care what your opinion about this topic is. What I care about is how you are doing research. And like for that, you don't need too many first person pronouns to get that accomplished. But that's not to say that you can't use the first person. And I definitely agree with the MLA that, there's some ways that like using the first person brings a sense of your personal identity into your writing. And I don't want you also to be bloodless robots that just churn out, completely sterile versions of research writing, right? Part of the goals of this class is to help you cultivate voice, and you can't cultivate voice if you don't like play around with perspective. So, I'm not going to tell you not to use it, but what like the passive voice, what I'm going to tell you is be intentional. Are you using this first person for a reason? What's going on with it? Why are you addressing me as from the first person in this case, right? And good places to do this in your writing will be in your introduction and your conclusion. Those are like a little bit less formal, right? And you'll see a lot of like research writing, even produced at like the highest levels of like scientific writing and stuff. You'll see some first person pronouns mixed into their introductions, their abstracts, because it's a little bit of like, I wanted to investigate this problem, right? You'll see a little bit of meta commentary being introduced. And so like this is from the MLA Style Center blog, which you can follow this link and go to the MLA Style Center blog itself. It's a pretty useful little website. They've got a lot of different topics that the blog covers. Some of them are research topics. Some of them are general writing topics. But this one is about using I in academic writing. So I figured, hey, we're governed by the MLA. Whatever they says goes. And this is stuff that isn't exactly covered totally in the MLA handbook itself. But, the things that Candell comes to is, if you're narrating how you made a discovery and the process of your discovery is important or at least entertaining, right? If you're describing how you teach something or how your students have responded or respond, right? This would be like if I were maybe getting published in like the Journal of Education or something like that. And I wanted to be like, I implemented this interesting pink background into my referential writing and my students responded with very lukewarm appreciation of it. If you disagree with another scholar, want to stress that you are not waving the banner of absolute truth. Very rarely will anyone be in possession of something like absolute truth, especially in a research paper, especially, in the very, very short time that we have together. Will you be denouncing someone as an absolute heretic, right? You shouldn't be denouncing people as heretics, first of all, in your research paper. That's a little strong of language to be using. I don't know, you're not Galileo, right? This isn't the 15th century Catholic Church. But if you run into something and you are making a novel argument and you want to express disagreement and you have an argument yourself to make, then you might defer to the first person there. Like, I respectfully disagree with this, right? And this is why I respectfully disagree with this. You need to use I for rhetorical effect to be clear, simple, or direct, right? In cases where it would if the thing that you're trying to say would just be so inelegant and convoluted to express from the third person that it would just be easier to use the first person to say the thing, just use the first person, right? That's fine. Like I said, I'm not going to call the grammar police on you and be like, that one right there, officer. She's the one that's been using the first person all semester. She won't stop it. They'll be like, we're going to arrest you next for that weird mid-Atlantic accent. So strategies for developing referential writing, and these will be useful questions to ask yourself going into the weekend whenever you're working on your free writing assignments. Is your thesis clearly stated? Again, you don't have to, I'm not going to hold you to whatever you write in your free writing, right? But thinking about these questions at the early stage. Does what evidence validly relates to your thesis? By what standards is the validity of the evidence validity? That's wrong emphasis on the wrong syllable. By what standards is the validity of the evidence established? Is the validity of the evidence apparent? Is all the evidence available? What conclusions does the evidence suggest? Does the conclusion account for all the evidence? Is the conclusion supported by most of the evidence, right? All of these, again, not necessarily questions that you're answering right off the bat, especially over the weekend, but things that you might want to start thinking about as you're like doing some background and exploratory reading and research and things like, especially this idea of, what are the standards by which I'm establishing validity, right? That's probably the most, what I would call like the epistemological question of research. Like, how do we know what we know, right? How do you know it's true? How do you know it's credible? And we'll spend a little bit of time, especially next week, unpacking this question of how do you know that the thing is credible? By what standards or by what criteria can we evaluate something as credible? That's going to be really important. That's like of continuing importance, not just in this class, but basically, I mean, any media literate society worth its salt has standards by which it establishes the credibility of the information that it's getting. So that'll be a big part of what we're doing is assessing evidence, assessing validity over the course of the semester. That does bring us to kind of a soft close. I'll introduce some ideas of classification just to get you a head start on what it is, but we'll probably circle back to this a little bit more thoroughly next time, but we'll get going on it. Does anybody have any specific questions about maybe the research assignments? We might be able to better use these last few minutes to talk about that coming up next week. Comments, concerns about any of that? I see that some people have already started at least working on that, which is good. I get the little blue clock in the grade book that shows that some people have at least started saving drafts of the free writing for next time. Actually, I'll just, rather than like try to rush through any of that, we'll just save classification for next time. And I'll underscore that our readings for next week, so there won't technically be any readings, well, not technically, there won't literally be any readings due for Tuesday, right? We're not really going to talk about readings. What I want y'all to concentrate on mostly this weekend is, if you haven't, at this point, I mean, y'all can play around with it. Like, if you want to try to write your research free writing totally from the third person, I think it would be good practice for sure. I'm not requiring you to write it from the third person because it's still free writing, right? It's still like brainstorming on paper. And some of the questions that I ask you are definitely more like express to me why you are specifically interested in something. So there's definitely like a little bit of an expressive component. And can we write on any topic we desire? I will say with some qualification, yes. Generally, you're going to produce the most high quality work on something that you're interested in. There's definitely some topics that I'm less excited about than others. I really don't need to hear your argument for why marijuana needs to be legalized. There's a couple of those every semester, and they're not good. First of all, I've already heard a lot of the arguments. Second of all, those papers don't yield the greatest research. But again, it's something that if it's important to you and you can justify wanting to look at it, then I'm not going to tell you to not investigate an idea. But what I will tell you is that ask yourself, what are especially with if you want to investigate like a controversial topic or something that's like a little bit more provocative. I've had in the past, I had a paper where a student wanted to write about capital punishment. And they didn't really want to write a research paper about capital punishment. They wanted to tell me in a very didactic way that bad people need to die. And I had a real hard time getting that student to confront their assumptions about the justice system, which is not perfect and is flawed. And, if you're going to write about capital punishment, you have to confront the idea that sometimes we kill innocent people. That's just a feature of the justice system. That's the nature of an adversarial court system. That fact itself doesn't make it is not like an argument for or against anything. It's just a piece of information that you have to contend with. And so if you want to write about ideologically prickly topics, you have to be willing to confront your own assumptions about stuff. Some of you have probably taken a philosophy class. If you've taken an ethics class, then maybe you've gone through that process a little bit already. It's not an easy process to go through. Sometimes you will encounter an argument that you're like, I just don't understand why people would feel differently about this than I do. If that's the way that you feel about an argument or a topic, then maybe pick something that you can maintain a little bit more objectivity about, or something that you feel like maybe I don't know as much. Another thing I see that sort of sends people in the wrong direction is I feel like I have to write about something that I already know all the information about, or that I'm already familiar with. Sometimes the best research that you're going to produce is going to be about a topic that you know almost nothing about. Find out about it, right? That you'll uncover your blind spots as you go. It's a little bit easier to see where your blind spots are. Whereas, if you want to write about a topic that is very close to some deeply held ethical, moral, or ideological value that you hold very close, it might be difficult to divorce yourself emotionally from that topic to maintain objectivity. So again, like I said, I'm not going to tell you outright to not write about anything, but it's all about intention. Why do you want to write about this topic? Are you writing about this topic because you're curious and you want to find out more? Or are you writing about this topic because you've been waiting for somebody to hear the crazy argument you've been having in the shower with yourself for the past 15 years or something? Just understanding and cultivating awareness of why you want to do the thing you want to do, which is part of why I ask you to bring a list of a couple of topics that you might be interested in, write about one at a little bit more length in the free writing, but then, have some backup ideas that maybe when I read your thing, I'm like, well, maybe, why do you want to know about these other ideas? Might be some of the feedback I would give you. This, maybe your free writing sounds interesting, but it's also oh, maybe you have some ideas on your list of topics that are oh, that's interesting to, these are such different ideas or something like that. Maybe it seems like maybe you have a really strong bias already in this one topic. Maybe you should look into this other topic that maybe you don't have a strong bias in. Right? Again, if you're willing to confront your biases, I don't care what you write about. I'm not here to tell you what is or what is not knowledge. I'm just here to tell you how to evaluate the garbage that you encounter on the way to figuring out what the truth is, whatever the truth may be. Any other questions? It's a good question about topics.
This research free writing is not part of the discussion board, right? There's a place to submit our work, kind of like
right.
It's the orientation quiz.
It's got its own. If you go to the course content and you go into the research module, it will be the first. Well, not the beginning of research paper. Here, let me put the student preview mode on. That way you can see in the course content, if you go to research module, it's this first assignment right here, right? And you submit to this by just clicking on the link next to the icon, and then it's going to bring up the assignment submission page. And at that point, it looks exactly like a discussion thread would look, only not everybody gets to see it, only I see it. Does the research project have to be based on a question that we answered throughout the essay? Yeah, that's a good way of putting it, actually, Kylie, is that what we're doing now is we're laying some groundwork for how are we going to formulate a specific question that we're going to investigate. And then the thesis that we develop is the answer, it's the one sentence answer to that question. And then the draft of your research paper is the extended answer to that question. It's how we're marshaling lots of information to provide a robust answer to a specific question that we're going to formulate. So we're just sort of laying the groundwork for what that question is at this point. Cool, good questions. And again, feel free to use any of my resource links in here. I definitely use the research databases. We'll go over again a little bit more of like, evaluating websites next week. Is there any examples I can look at as a reference for the research, just so I know I have the structure correct? I mean, it's a pretty open structure. I don't really have any models of a response to this specific thing. So I kind of like tweak this a little every time I throw it out for a different semester. But what I'm looking for most specifically are these things down here. A list of at least 3 topics that you're interested in, right? So in some way, if you want to like write in a text submission box, if you want to create a Word document, somewhere give me a list of 3 ideas, right? Just 3 things. That could be topics for a research paper, alternative energy. Why are avocados so expensive? I keep coming back to that one. They went up again. They're $1.08 now. It's getting outrageous. For one avocado, man. It's insane. A free writing of at least 200 words about one of those topics which interests you that respond to the prompt, right? So what I have are some questions here that you don't necessarily have to answer all of these, but these are really just like sort of generating ideas questions, right? Responding to a few of these questions will generate 200 words of content for sure, right? You can go way over that, but what I'm really looking for is like some list of ideas and then just some spitballing, right? I'm interested in this one topic. Here's why I'm interested in it. These are the things that I think I know about it. Like, just kind of go wild. Answering some of these, using these resources. This is, a brainstorming topic chart. Do you care if we have the questions in the submitted paper? No, not necessarily. That's fine. You can you can develop your content as a coherent paragraph. You can do sort of like question and answer, as long as your original content adds up to 200 words at minimum. That's really all I'm looking for. If it adds up to 200 words, including the questions, then I'm going to be a little upset. Are the bullet points there to guide us? Yeah, they're really more of like a guide. Like I said, you don't have to answer all of those questions. If you do answer all of those questions, you're highly likely to produce at least 200 words of content. But it's really more of moving you towards this idea of like, okay, I'm brainstorming in real time. I'm brainstorming with a prompt in mind. I'm trying to flesh out an idea of like, writing with the idea that, I'm trying to formulate a question that I want to answer. Like, here's a topic that's, like, let's go back to talking about like maybe energy or something. Like, in the past, I've talked about this before. Like, maybe the topic that you're really interested in is nuclear power, say. Maybe you know a little bit about nuclear power. Maybe, I know that nuclear power has to do with splitting an atom. I vaguely know what a chain reaction is. I could probably describe what a chain reaction is. A chain reaction is where you release a neutron and you fire a neutron at an atom, and it splits that atom, and then that energy creates more neutrons, like sort of bonkering out in all different directions, which split more atoms, which release more neutrons, and that's basically how nuclear reactions work. I know that they're like pretty dangerous. I know the words Fukushima and 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl, and I even know about something called SR1, which was a US Army nuclear reactor that melted down and killed 3 guys in the 60s, maybe. I know that it's a highly contentious form of energy that some people think is green, but other people think is inherently disastrous to the environment. I think I know what green means, but I also think that people throw that word around a lot and it's not really well defined. I know that they're like green and sustainable aren't necessarily the same thing. I know that carbon free is not necessarily the same thing. I know that there are fossil fuels and alternative energy sources that some people think nuclear energy is included as an alternative energy. Some people think that it's not, right? So there's like, that's like sort of spitballing ideas. Like that's like, maybe if I could collect all that into like a coherent paragraph of some kind, maybe not even a coherent paragraph, right? Like, and maybe at the end of the day, maybe the thing I want to figure out is like, is nuclear power worthwhile? Like, should we be building more nuclear power plants, or should we not do that? And you know, maybe I'll refine that question once I learn a little bit more about the topic. Maybe, and then eventually I'll come up with like some kind of thesis statement, like nuclear power is the only alternative to get us to a sustainable future. Maybe that's my thesis. Maybe my thesis is nuclear power is a ticking time bomb waiting to destroy civilization. You know, it could be, it's not necessarily the only dichotomy there could be. Maybe your position is somewhere more modest than that. But also included in here is this developing a topic, which is this little tab up here. There's a couple of short videos that you can watch here. How to write a good research question. It's going to go over a little bit about how to formulate a research question. You know, finding background information and creating a research question. Both these are like pretty short videos, but they're very informative about, you know, the kinds of skills that I'm asking you to sort of marshal in this assignment. Does that address our concerns pretty robustly?
I have a question.
I have an answer.
So, when it comes to the free writing or the project overall, what style are we writing in? Are we writing it persuasive or like reference or whatever you call it?
You're going to, once we get to the actual draft, down here, is a referential and persuasive focus, right? So part of what you're going to be doing is giving me information, right? And part of what you're going to be doing is convincing me of something. Basically, you're convincing me that like your answer is a good answer. It's a plausible, valid answer to your research question. And then the referential focus would be, you know, giving me enough information to understand the context in which your answer is persuasive. If that makes sense? And so eventually we're aiming at having both of those purposes married in harmony of providing information and using that information to persuade. Great. All right. I will bring us to a soft landing there. I'll go ahead and stop our recording.